Hello everyone, welcome to my channel. Today we're going to cover the BIOS or Basic Input-Output System. What is it? How does it work? How do you enter the BIOS setup to configure different settings? When should you update the BIOS? And finally, what are the differences between UEFI and legacy BIOS? As always, you'll find all the relevant links in the description below. So let's start with the basics. What exactly is the BIOS? It's essentially a firmware that runs on your computer, and its role is to perform some basic hardware initialization tasks during the booting process. So right after you press the power button, the BIOS will kick in and check each of your hardware components. For example, the CPU, the RAM, the hard disk or SSD, the GPU, and so on. This is called a power on self-test or a POST for short. And if everything is working properly, then it will pass without any problems. But if there is an issue with any component, then the BIOS will emit a beep code or sometimes display an error message informing you about the problem. Beep codes vary depending on the manufacturer, but usually 3 short beeps means memory-related error, 3 long beeps means CPU-related problem. Next, the BIOS will detect and configure all the hardware components, such as the storage devices, the USB ports, and other peripherals. Then it proceeds to load the bootloader, which is a small program that searches for an operating system to boot. Load. The bootloader looks at the boot order, which is basically the list of storage devices to check in a specific sequence. For example, first it checks the first M2 slot, then the first SATA slot, and so on. Hence, this boot order can be configured in the BIOS. By default, the most recent storage devices added to the motherboard are prioritized. So, for example, if you insert a USB drive, it will come up first in the boot order list. Also, keep in mind that the empty slots have lower priority than the populated ones. So, for example, if your first SATA port is empty, then the second one has a higher priority. Once the bootloader finds a valid and bootable device, like a hard disk or SSD, a USB drive, or a CD/DVD, it loads the operating system and hands over the control to it. And after that, the BIOS continues to provide so-called runtime services to the OS. These are some low-level hardware access functions that the OS can call to get information about the system. For example, how many CPUs you have, what's their clock speed, and so on. BIOS also manages the power settings and interfaces with the CPI, which is a software that controls power transitions between different states. And finally, BIOS handles the system, time, and date. Now, let's see how you can check the BIOS information. In Windows, simply press the Windows plus R keys together and then type mcinfo32 and hit OK. You now get a window with different system information, and here you can see the BIOS version and the date when it was installed. So alternatively, you can also check this information in command prompt. Let's run the following command and it will output the same data. Okay, and in Linux, open a terminal and run the following command. In this case, we use the dmcode utility to print the BIOS information. Here, we specify the -T option to indicate that we want to get the BIOS table. Otherwise, it will list all the DMI tables, okay? And as you can see, we get the manufacturer information and other data. Speaking of the manufacturer, there are 4 main companies that produce BIOS: AMI, Award, Phoenix, and Inside, okay? Nowadays, UEFI is replacing BIOS, and it's more of a successor than a replacement because it has more capabilities. But we'll talk about it later in the video. At the moment, these are just some of the BIOS information, and let's move on to the configuration part. So how do you actually enter the BIOS? Well, when you restart your PC right after the post, which is the power on self-test, you will see this screen. All you have to do is press a key to enter the BIOS. Usually, that key is delete or F2 or F10 or F12 or escape, right? But it differs depending on the manufacturer. Key. You can search online for your specific motherboard model to learn what key to press. Now, in Windows 10 or 11, if you have fast boot enabled, then you might not see the initial BIOS screen, and to enter the BIOS in this case, go to Start and type MCV032 and hit Enter. Then press the Advanced Startup button at the bottom. Then select the Restart Now option and follow the steps. Now, in this window, select Troubleshoot, then Advanced Options, and then UE5 Firmware Settings, and then press Enter. Now, you are in the BIOS. In the BIOS, you have plenty of settings to tweak and configure. Obviously, don't mess with anything unless you know what you're doing. But I'll show you some common settings and categories you can find here. So you get a lot of different categories and options. And let's start with the boot. This is the boot configuration, and it lets you set the priority for different storage devices. For example, if you want to prioritize your SSD over the hard disk, simply move the SSD up above the HDD. There are also some other options like CSM, which stands for Compatibility Support Mode. We'll talk about it in more detail later when discussing the differences between UEFI and legacy BIOS. For now, just remember that CSM is related to legacy BIOS and Secure Boot. Speaking of Secure Boot, it's a feature that is needed for Windows 11. And TPM stands for Trusted Platform Module. And again, it's needed for Windows 11. And virtualization refers to technologies like Intel, VTX, and AMDV, which are needed if you want to run virtual machines. For example, VirtualBox or VMware. Next comes XMP or DOCP. These two options are related to RAM overclocking. And if you have high-speed RAM, which is usually the case for gamers, make sure to enable one of those two options. Otherwise, you might not get the full speed out of your RAM sticks. AHCI and NVMe modes are required if you have an SSD. If you don't enable them, your SSD will run in a compatibility mode, and it will perform much worse. And next, we have some other options like fan control. If you want to manually adjust the CPU or chassis fans, then you can configure that here. And overclocking allows you to adjust CPU and RAM voltages and stuff like that. But keep in mind that these are advanced settings, and if you don't know what you're doing, don't touch them. If you're not comfortable with all these settings and changes, you can always reset the BIOS to the defaults. To do that, simply navigate to the Load Optimized Defaults menu item and select Yes. And if even that doesn't help, you can always clear the CMOs, which will wipe out all the settings and restore them back to the defaults. Usually, it's as simple as removing the motherboard battery for 5 minutes or using a special jumper to clear the CMOs, but it depends on your motherboard. Okay. Check the manual for instructions. Finally, I'd like to answer the question, when should you update the BIOS? Well, in most cases, the BIOS updates are released to fix some hardware compatibility issues. Sometimes they patch security vulnerabilities, for example, the Spectre and Meltdown vulnerabilities, and also BIOS updates add support for new processors. And now, let's see how to update the BIOS. First, check the current version. You can do that either with the msinfo3 to command, or by looking at the BIOS version field in the BIOS. Then go to the manufacturer's website. For example, if you have an Asus Tech ROG Strix X570F gaming motherboard, then you go to asus.com and search for the support section. Then select your product, and then under the BIOS category, you can find the latest BIOS file to download. Then go ahead and download it. Keep in mind that usually the BIOS files have very small size, something around 1 or 2 megabytes. After that, you need to flash the BIOS. To do that, you can use a USB drive. It should be formatted in FAT32 file system, and then you copy the BIOS file to it, and then you insert it, into the PC, and then you restart it and enter the BIOS, and in the boot menu, you should see an option called BIOS Flash Utility. Simply select it, and it will start flashing the BIOS. Keep in mind that you should never power off your PC while the BIOS is being flashed. Otherwise, you might damage your motherboard. Worst case scenario, you might end up with a bricked motherboard. So just make sure that during the flashing process, you don't turn off the PC. Alternatively, Some manufacturers provide a Windows-based flashing tool. For example, the Armory Crate application from Asus, so you can choose the BIOS file and then flash it directly from within Windows. Okay, and once it's done, you can reboot your PC and check the BIOS version again to confirm that the update was successful. And now, let's talk about the differences between UEFI and Legacy BIOS. Feature: Legacy BIOS Wi-Fi boot mode, MBR GPT boot, speed slower than UEFI, faster. It's faster than Legacy BIOS GUI. It's text-based. It's graphical. It's portnet supported. And finally, I'd like to share some tips. Make sure to back up your BIOS settings before making any changes. Don't update the BIOS unless you really need to. If you run games, make sure to enable XMP if your RAM sticks support it. And if you're experiencing issues with hardware detection, try disabling fast boot. So that's it. I hope you learned something new. If you have any questions, leave them in the comments. And if you'd like me to cover some specific BIOS settings, or maybe dive deeper into a certain aspect of the BIOS, then also let me know. And thank you for watching. Till next time.